This gentleman in our circles doesn't need much of an introduction. Jody Dillow is a person that I knew about long before I got to meet him. And I met him at a conference in our church. Thank you so much. And it is a pleasure every time I get to sit with this man in the same room. His expertise is not just on the page of books like Final Destiny that I continually pick up. Almost every month I'm reading something in that book, and I realize I've read it before and I've underlined it and started taking notes, and I'm still going back to it. But he's going to both share some things about his ministry and give us a plenary session. Would you welcome Dr. Jody Dillow to the stage? Thanks, mate. Appreciate you. Need anything, sir?
Mike, we're good. Thanks. Supposed to give a brief comment about a ministry that we're involved in. One of them is FGA, and I love these conferences, appreciate everybody. It's always been a privilege for me to have a part. I decided, I've been kind of going back and forth on which ministry to talk about, and I think I've changed my mind. The reason is I'm involved in two things. One, I have a picture up there, and I'll just refer it to you for the future. It's called the internetseminary.org. It's a ministry with the ministry called BEE that I've been involved in for about 40 years. We started in Eastern Europe, the former Soviet Union. And since then, we have migrated all of our courses in Chinese, Vietnamese, Arabic. In fact, we're going into 12 languages up on the internet. And these are biblical, I would say like first year university level, perhaps. High school graduate is our niche. So the kind of thing you can use in your church. I did it, teaching a Life of Christ course, for example, and the students could take the course online. It's interactive, multimedia, there's movies and drag and drop and all these kinds of things. And then Sunday morning, we just had interactive discussion. And we found that people really liked it because it wasn't another night out. All they had to do was spend 20 minutes a day online taking the course and taking some notes in a life notebook and then come prepared to discuss. So I'll leave that for those of you that are interested to look at. But the ministry that I'm very much involved in now, my wife really got me into it. By the way, I was telling Gail that Linda and I have a joke around our house. She writes books that people read. But about 7-8 years ago, we got involved with wounded women. My wife has worked with women for about 20 years, 5 of whom were involved in satanic ritual abuse, put into that horror as young girls, even at 4 years of age. And as a result, many of them have what is now called complex trauma, which is the new term for dissociative identity disorder, multiple personality. And there were many weeks where my wife spent for many years 20 hours with individual women. We'd have them in our home for a week or so while Linda ministered to them. For some of them, I couldn't even come downstairs because I was a man. One young lady I met at a safe house that we had created. She escaped SRA in Canada. And I'll never forget the first time I met her. I was coming down the stairwell, and she was at the bottom of the stairwell. And as soon as she saw me, she curled up like this. It was a man, danger. What's he going to do to me? And over the course of a number of years, we got to know her. Her name was Jessa. And she was from Canada, and we need to get her a visa. And the only thing we could figure was to get her a student visa. Problem was, she's never been to school. She had roughly a 6th grade education. And she thought she was stupid because her dad told her that she was stupid, and her purpose in the family was to raise money. It's all she was good for. Well, Nazarene Bible College was just up the street, so we got her involved in taking the, what do you call it, the graduate equivalency, whatever that thing is, GDE, and she did it in a month, passed the thing, and got accepted. The first day of classes, the counselor at this safe house, we called it House Ephraim, took her there. She was terrified. She'd never been in a schoolroom. She thought she was stupid, and now she's going to college. And she sat on the curb and cried in fear. At the end of the first semester, she had straight A's. We had some of her professors over for dinner. They told us that she was brilliant. She graduated summa cum laude. She's now at Denver Seminary working toward a PhD with her husband, who is just a fantastic guy, who's also working on his PhD. He wants to go the direction of apologetics. She wants to go in the direction of possibly getting on the faculty of a secular university and creating a department of complex trauma. Right now, she's in demand for training on trafficking. The FBI has her as a standard speaker at their training seminars to train their agents. The Department of Homeland Security invites her to seminars. She's speaking at the Air Academy to 2,000 people in a month on a leadership training initiative. Well, through Jessa, I got involved. I became dad. In fact, we have informally adopted her as one of our kids. We now have 5, although this one's 30 years old. But she has been in contact, along with my wife, with a ministry in Kenya, with an incredible lady by the name of Flora, university professor, seminary grad, who left it all to work with street girls who are being trafficked in the streets of Kenya. It's called New Scent International. And Linda got involved in this, Jessa was involved, so what could I do? And right now I'm more of a fundraiser than anything else, so I'm trying to help Flora get together a new center. She needs $100,000, which I was surprised, but it'll handle 80 to 100 girls. And that's her dream. The girls she has in there, some of them at 4 years of age, were trafficking their bodies just to get money to survive. And all of this really touched my heart. So I spent a lot of time helping with PowerPoints and websites and counsel on this and that I know something about. And then, of course, Linda has been interacting with her as a mentor, probably over 200 emails, because Linda's had all this experience with wounded women. And, of course, Jessa was one of them. And Jessa and John, her husband, are going to Kenya in January to spend about 2 weeks getting a hands-on look-see of how we can help. So those are the 2 things I'm doing, the Internet Biblical Seminary and then something totally different, this New Scent International. Flora is developing a website. It's almost finished, but eventually it'll be newscentinternational.org. Might be up by now, I'm not sure, but they're still working on it. Okay, this morning, see, I better get my glasses here. What happened to the pictures? There we go. Yeah, I went to sleep. I told it not to go to sleep. The theme this week has been making disciples. I am a collector of the last words of great men. Every time I get some of these books, a biography, I go to the last chapter. And I do this a lot with secular cosmologists too, because after they've mapped out their materialistic worldview, I wonder, where they think purpose in life is. So I go to the last chapter. I used to be in a ministry called Christian Family Life, and we had a really older man there. I mean, he was ancient, about 45. And we were just a bunch of kids in our early 30s going around the country teaching people your age how to raise teenagers. It was kind of ridiculous, but the one part we did have some experience on was marriage, so that's what we emphasized. And Milton, as this older man, we called him Uncle Milty, came down with terminal cancer a couple of years ago. And I decided I needed to go see him. He was just about on the verge of hospice. In fact, he lived up here north of Dallas. So I took him out to lunch and I said, Milty, you're about to finish your course. What words would you like to give to me as counsel? And he said, Jody, 2 words: make disciples. And he was still doing it. He was having people over to his home. He was working with, I think, 3 or 5 guys, I can't remember, coming over and discipling these guys. It was very convicting to me because I'm, up front, writing books, teaching publicly, but the one-on-one discipleship I had let go. And that's what we've been talking about here. I've really appreciated some of the messages I've heard. In fact, personally, I think this is some of the best messages I've heard since coming to these conferences. I've been convicted and challenged. So I want to talk to you about making disciples. And I'm going to describe a lot of things that relate to our experience. And first of all, I just want to start out with a kind of an obvious point that there is a worldwide need. 17 years ago, AD 2000 said, there are 5 million church leaders that have had no access to any kind of advanced biblical training. According to a Christianity Today article, 100,000 people a day are coming to Christ. So we need 1,000 new leaders every day, figure 1 for every 100. That's 365,000 new leaders a year. In 10 years, we need 3.6 million new leaders. 85% of churches in the world are led by men and women with no formal training in theology or ministry. 70% of church plants fail after 2 years because of the lack of biblical training. This comment was made last week by Ramesh Richards at a conference here in Dallas. I think it's called the General Association of Church Planters or something like that. And we're participating in that. So church plants are going all over the place, but because there's not a follow-through in training the leaders, many of them are failing. Now that's not true of all of them by any means, but that's a pretty sobering number according to what Ramesh said. If every Christian training institute in the world operated at 120% of capacity, less than 10% of the unequipped leaders would receive training. 80% of those who come to the West to receive training never return home. We've been doing this for 40 years in many, many countries. And leaders from every non-Western region say their number one need is leadership training. And what they mean by that is biblical leadership equipping. Now, how would Paul the Apostle have met this need if he were alive today? That's the question I want to address here. And the answer is clear from his writings. It would be by indigenous multiplication. I want to take you back to the first century. The apostle was ending his life in this prison, the Mamertine prison. I've been in it, not as an inmate, but as a visitor. It's below the streets of Rome. It's 6 meters by 9 meters. It's cold. It's unsanitary. And as Paul wasted away, or no, I shouldn't say that, rotted away or spent his last days, he reflected back on his life and ministry. And most of all, he thought of Timothy. And he picked up the pen and he said, Paul, an apostle of Jesus Christ, according to the promise of life, which is in Christ Jesus, to Timothy, my beloved son, grace, mercy, and peace to you from God the Father and Christ Jesus, our Lord. The burden of 2 Timothy was to encourage this young man who apparently was somewhat timid and impart to him Paul's ministry strategy for reaching the world and encouraging him to implement it. So here was his mandate: train faithful men who are able to teach others also. We're all familiar with this. Many missions use this as a mandate. We certainly do. When I was with Campus Crusade for 8 years, that was our Bible. The navs have it printed in every brochure. And the things which you have heard from me in the presence of many witnesses, these entrust to faithful men who will be able to teach others also. So the first part of Paul's mandate was biblical information, the things which you have heard from me. But he was also concerned about character. He wanted faithful men. And he had an outcome in mind, not just the imparting of information, but he wanted to train them to be able to teach others also. Now, to put this in modern education speak, there was knowing, being, and doing. So his mandate was clear, but I want to note two things. He wanted able men. That word simply means competent. But he puts it in the future tense, will be able. In other words, Timothy, as a result of your training, I want the outcome to be men and women who are able to pass this on to others also. That's the future tense. They may not be able yet, just like those disciples. Come, follow me. All they knew how to do was fish for fish. But Jesus said, follow me, and I'm going to train you to become fishers of men. So Paul thought in terms of indigenous multiplication, from Paul to Timothy to faithful men to others also. 4 generations of multiplication was his vision for reaching the world. The final one was entrust it to them. So they own it. It's no longer Timothy's ministry, but their ministry. They've personalized it, taken it over, and run it themselves. So his strategy was indigenous multiplication, and that involved nationals training nationals. Now, we've been doing this for 40 years, almost. See, since 79, so whatever that adds up to. And we're in, 30 countries. My own involvement was primarily in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union, and then in China and in Vietnam. And over the years, we've identified 5 keys to indigenous multiplication. These developed from our experience as well as biblical references. But you've got a prepared curriculum. I'm going to comment on these in a moment. Proper selection of students. Clarify expectations in philosophy. What are we here for? It has to be a transferable curriculum that the nationals can teach, or you don't get multiplication. It needs to be a transferable teaching method that they can duplicate. There has to be accountability, and it has to emphasize people and relationships. Repeated personal contact for 3 to 5 years. Takes a long time to build some of those relational connections. And entrust the work to them as soon as possible. And we found in every country we've worked in where we were successful in implementing those 9 keys, we saw indigenous multiplication. We weren't always successful. In some countries things exploded, some did not. But it all hinged on whether or not we were able to impart. There's more than that, but a key thing was the implementation of these keys. So I like to talk about each one of them and what we mean by that. First of all, a prepared curriculum. This is important for a couple of reasons. The first is the issue of losing momentum. If you go into a country, and I'm thinking in terms of a church mission initiative at this point. This stuff could be duplicated to some extent in local churches here in the United States. In fact, we've even done it in a couple of churches. But I'm thinking in terms of short-term mission trips by the church that you're in or that you'd like to participate. So I'm going to speak from that frame of reference. But still, the principles would apply and have applied here in local churches. If you start a bunch of people into a curriculum and then you don't have the next course ready, it kills the thing. And we've seen it. We've made those mistakes because they're interested in pursuing and then you're not prepared to follow through. But there's a second issue, and that's credibility. I remember when we started in Romania, I had talked to the pastors there about this wonderful vision we had for training pastors in Romania. And they listened and they were really excited about it. And I finally got the first course into them. It was a course on New Testament survey, and it was based around Tenney's book. And passed that book out in the workbook, and man, they wrapped it in brown paper and they handled it like it was the most precious thing they'd ever seen. And I remember Joseph Sirocco, who was the head of it, said, "Brother Jody, we love you and we trust you, but here's the book." Problem is, many people have gone into these countries, made promises, and didn't follow through. So that I thought, oh wow, I'm glad we could follow through. So the point here is that have 3 courses ready before you launch so that you don't run into a loss of momentum and a loss of credibility. Now, we're moving toward multi-platform delivery. All of our courses are available on paper. They're available on thumb drives. A student can download the PDF to their hard disk, or they can download an executable that will duplicate the experience on the website right on their own computer. We're now migrating to tablets, smartphones. If a person doesn't have a computer, almost every place we go, they've got that smartphone. In fact, we have to tell them to turn it off during the seminars. Now, it's not true at every case, but that's where the future is. And all the future leaders in all these countries, I can't say all of them, but most of them have access to the internet. The 20, 30-somethings are the target, and they're the ones that are going to be the next generation of leaders. If you are wondering about how to do this, you could do it yourself. Get a program called iSpring, and you can look at their website, iSpring.com. It shows how to develop one of the courses that you use, maybe a course that you've written or material that you've written for your church. You can put it into PowerPoint, although this is really not PowerPoint. What it is, it's based on PowerPoint. and it's an add-on that costs about $640. And it has about 15 different interaction types, all kinds of formatting things. I mean, you could really do some incredible stuff. These guys are based out of Moscow. They wrote the code. They all speak perfect English, but they're very responsive to tech support. So if you're interested in exploring that, I could recommend you use ispring.com and create your own church training or your own ministry training of some kind. I'd be glad to talk with anybody that wants to do that. The second issue is careful selection. We want people who will be able. In other words, the reason you're doing this, this is not the only reason people do this. I mean, there are all kinds of ministries with an effect. I would say I've had very little exposure in my own life to this kind of training until I went with Campus Crusade, but even then I was doing it for others. Most of my training came through lectures, and that was fantastic. It encouraged me. I learned. What I'm suggesting here is a little bit different, that we shift the focus not so much to lectures, but to interactive training, and this involves careful selection of students. You see the potential that they could actually do this. So when we invite people into a group, we're asking a question, is this person committed to do the work? And is he the kind of person that has networks or people that he can gather into a group and multiply the training to others? Let me see. I made a big mistake in Burma. I worked through a president of a seminary there who wanted his students in this seminary to have this training. So I thought, well, he's the boss and he knows. I told him what this is about. These are not Bible studies. This is training people how to train others. Oh, no problem, Brother Jody. So he invites, I don't know, it was probably 30 people in this group, and that's really too big for us. We only normally ask for about 10 or 12. But so I went back, I think, 3 times, and each time when I'd start the interaction and the questions, these students would just stare blankly at me. And I thought, well, am I doing something wrong? I couldn't get them involved. Finally, I went and talked to the president, Paul. Now, who are these kids? Not kids, they were 20, 30-somethings, and it gets relative at my age. And said, well, here's the problem, Jody. The university shut down. The military junta shut it down. So these kids are looking for something to do, and they want to learn English. And probably half of them weren't even believers. That's why there was no good interaction. So you need to lesson learned. Be very careful who you're inviting, because you could be wasting your time. I wasted 3 trips at $2,500 a pop before I could figure out what was going on. The third key is clarify expectations and accountability. In other words, I've kind of already talked about this pretty much, but the idea is make it clear this is not a Bible study. You're here to learn how to disciple others. And we tell them up front that by the end of the 2nd or 3rd course, you have to have your own group or you can't continue in the training. And we want, right at that 1st or 2nd time we're with them, we say, now we want everybody here to make a list of at least 5 people that you're going to start praying for with the vision of starting your own group. This is key for a transferable curriculum. There's a verse here that has always struck me in Paul's instruction to Timothy. He says, retain the standard of sound words which you have heard from me, in faith and love, which is in Christ Jesus. You can see by that Greek word what this might mean, something like upatuposis. You hear the word type in there. And basically it means an outline or a sketch. Now I doubt that they had enough paper to do a lot of this in the first century, but apparently there was some standard forms, and I think it was something like an outline, at least that's what the word can mean, that Paul wanted Timothy to have prepared to pass on to them so that his students could pass those on to others. Paul was definitely thinking of indigenous multiplication when he did this. Now, okay, I'll add this into the next key. Key 5 is a transferable teaching method that the nationals can duplicate. Now, for us, for the most part, that eliminates lecture. I can go into one of these countries and easily get 100, 200, even 1,000 people together. And that is I'm not knocking that at all. That's a wonderful ministry. I've sat into that ministry in many instances. It's changed my life dramatically. But if your goal is indigenous multiplication, you need a certain kind of people and a certain kind of strategy that enables them to multiply. And if I go in, and I've done this, for example, I remember I went into Romania once teaching the book of Hebrews. And I spent 30 hours one week going through Hebrews 1 to 6 with 12 Baptist pastors in Bucharest. This is back in 1980. And it was great. They never heard anybody do this kind of stuff. I mean, 30 hours on 6 chapters. You know, I'm doing this typical Dallas Seminary phrase by phrase, verse by verse, and then the theological inferences, and they were just fantastic, fantastic. And I never heard that in Dallas when I taught. But they were they'd never seen anything like that. And that was a great icebreaker. We established the contact, the relationships. I was with them for a week. And so that was a good use of the lecture method. But we do very little lecture because remember the goal. We want people who will be able to teach others also. And Paul also said, the Lord's bondservant must not be quarrelsome, but kindly to all, able to teach. Now, those men loved what I did on Hebrews, but none of them had the background to really take that forward. Maybe a couple of them did. So it wouldn't multiply. Now, one comment about quarrelsome. This comes up particularly with theological issues. We work with charismatics, Baptists, Reform, Lutheran, Orthodox, brethren, and we have a couple of free grace issues that we really camp on. Of course, a biggie is eternal security. But if we go in there and make an issue out of that, say the first couple of meetings or whatnot, there's a chance we'll lose the group. Because in most places around the world, at least in our experience, we find very few communities that believe in eternal security. In fact, most of them feel that anyone that teaches that is basically giving license to sin, because unless you have that threat of hell, people won't be godly. So we don't talk about it until we have established relationship. And that might take a year and a half in some cases. And then in the context of the courses, we can bring up some of these free grace issues. But we deal with charismatics, with all millennialists, premillennialists, and we have to be very, very cautious about how we do that. We do not want quarrels. Well, how do you train them? What do we actually do? Well, for us, it's interactive seminars. And this is something that we developed. First of all, it's in the Bible. That's how Jesus seemed to do it with the 12. But I remember when we first started back in 1980, we invited the CIA station chief in Moscow. He was a believer. And he came down and he ran a seminar with not only us, but some other missions that were doing this kind of work. And we wanted to know what they know, how we can keep from getting the nationals in trouble, and how can we avoid getting ourselves in trouble. And I remember he said, work in small groups on the edge of the city. If you can do it inside the church, you're probably okay. It's legal to talk about Christianity inside the church. So basically, he was forcing us to do what Jesus did, work with a small group and work through them to generate your multiplication. So we will have 10 or 12 people in a group typically, and we model a teaching method that's all interactive discussion. It's prepared. It's not one of these pooled ignorance sessions that we're afraid of. They've had to study three lessons before we meet with them. And then our time with them is involved in modeling a way they can teach it. But also, we want them to participate. In other words, we will give individuals opportunities to do part of the seminar, and then they'll get critiqued by their peers. And we'll send them out, just like Jesus did with the 70, and come back and discuss. At these seminars, we do three things. Since it's not lecture, what is it? Well, we emphasize the content and how it relates to their walk with God, a lot of personal application. But secondly, we discuss how this works in practical ministry and how they can pass it on. And thirdly, how to teach it to others. So those are our three goals as we go through. We're assuming that the instructor, that is the workbooks and the textbooks, the outlines, whatever you use, is the teacher. And basically we're just there to discuss how it applies to their life, how it applies to their ministry, and how to teach somebody else. And, of course, to answer questions. They'll come loaded with a lot of questions, so we have a lot of interaction that way. So we train them by modeling interactive facilitation, and then finally by giving them the lesson outlines so that they can go through with others what we just went through with them. Remember, retain that standard, that lesson outline. The next key is accountability. And the point here is that we should teach towards the whole person. And I'll talk a little bit about what I mean by that. Not just information, but also being, character qualities, and doing. Paul taught by example. He said, now you followed, he's talking to Timothy, my teaching. That was biblical knowledge. But also his conduct, which he describes as his purpose, faith, patience, love, perseverance in the midst of persecutions. So the first thing that enabled him to teach with credibility was authenticity. He was living what he taught, and they could see it. character. Now, one of the big questions that always comes up in missions is outcomes. If you sit and talk to a businessman or a foundation about money for your cause, they want to know what the outcomes are and what your success has been. And unfortunately, this always gets down to numbers, which is an important indicator. It was in the book of Acts, so there's nothing wrong with talking about numbers. But I remember reading an article in Christianity Today once that said if you added up all the numbers reported by all the missionary prayer letters, the world has been evangelized 7 times over. And so we've tried to be cautious in how we quote numbers. Well, then what is accountability? Well, obviously the knowing part's the easy part. That's what we do at seminaries. They give us exams and papers and we get a grade. Now for us, the accountability factor there is their test scores. We do give quizzes and we have final exams, all the standard stuff, but also seminar attendance and participation. And it kind of varies with the group, but we usually put about 40% of weight of a grade on seminar attendance and participation, not just sitting there staring blankly, but people that are engaged. Doing. How do you measure the outcome about doing? Well, it's a multiplication ratio. The multiplication ratio is the number in the first generation group. You had Paul, Timothy. So for us, the Timothys were the first generation group of 10, 12 people. So you've got that number. Let's say there's 10 in that group. And so you want the percentage of the people in the first generation group that are actually teaching their own first generation group, or from our perspective, the second generation down, faithful men. So let's say there's 7 in your group, or 10 in your group, and 7 of them are teaching. I think I got that upside down. Forget it. That you get the point. If you look at my slide there. So that'd be a 70% ratio. Now, we kept very careful records when we were in Eastern Europe and Russia. And our multiplication ratio was 70%, which to us gave us a kind of metric. We are in, I don't know the exact number, about 25 countries now, and I think the number of trained students is something like 35,000. I was talking with Al Bridges, who is our former president, and I asked him, well, what percentage of those are being taught by nationals? And he said 88%. And I cite this not to talk about us. This is a God thing. We've been in many places where it was 10%. But when these keys, these 9 keys are implemented, we have found inevitably that God does something in the lives of people. So that is a metric that we use, say, well, okay, we're at least hitting the 70% here, and that's what we'd like to see. Well, how about being? How do you measure character? Now, if you guys have an answer to that question, come up and talk to me. We never really have figured that out. The only way we do it now is anecdotally. We hear testimonies of people in the groups and how their lives have changed or how their marriage has changed. And so that's the kind of thing we can hear, so we know some good things are happening. I talked to some psychologists about this, and I asked them, how in the world could you score that in some way? And we've never done this, so I'll just throw it out to you. You might consider it for groups in your church or something. He said, well, you might try a Likert scale. And that's a survey. We actually have one up on our website that we've never used because a lot of our staff just don't want to do that. That's too invasive or something. So I dropped it, but I still like the idea. Essentially, you identify the character qualities that you want to teach toward, and then you go for self-evaluation on a scale of 1 to 5. And of course, they're either going to lie or they're going to be too humble. So the psychologist said, that's just human nature. So, but he said, what you do is then you give the test a year or 2 years later to the same people and see if there's movement. Seemed like a good idea to me. Maybe some of you are just agreeing with some of our staff. Forget it, Jody. But I like the idea. And that's something you might consider as a way of doing it. Here's some websites that Christians, that survey that I was talking about that we have not used is internetseminary.org. I Googled this at one point to build your own online. They actually have places that you can go online, create your own survey. It scores it for you. And you can put in the kind of questions that you want. So they're not revealing anything about these individual character qualities. There's just a general score that they might report on to you a couple of times. The seventh key, emphasize people and relationships. I remember when I became a Christian, it was 10:30 p.m. Thursday night, September 9th, 1963. So you Baptists out there can be satisfied. I'm in. And I was at a Christian college conference. I came to Christ through the death of a girl I was in love with. She was killed in an automobile accident. At the time, I was a total reprobate. Came to college extremely immature. Had no business in college, trying to major in electrical engineering on the side. But I was really after a 4-year keg party. And her death brought me up short. And through her parents, over a year's time, they loved me into the kingdom. And Mom got me to go to this Christian college conference at Mount Hermon. And at that conference, the lights went on. I got it. So on Thursday night at 10:30, I invited Jesus into my heart. No, Microsoft, I don't want your new. And I had read through parts of the Bible, in fact, maybe even half of the New Testament during this year. And I didn't understand it. I remember reading the Gospel of John. Frankly, I was a little turned off because this Jesus was saying, I am. I thought he was an egotist. My reaction was not very positive. But I remember after I'd trusted Christ, the next morning they were telling these kids to go out and have a quiet time. Well, I was in the club now, so I figured I'd better do this. So we all went out in the woods, and we were supposed to read our Bibles and pray or something. And I opened the Bible to the book of Genesis. I thought, well, I'll just start there at the beginning. I remember I got to chapter 5, where so-and-so begat so-and-so, who begat so-and-so, who begat so-and-so. And I thought, no, this isn't going to work. So I thought, well, I'll start with the New Testament. So I go to Matthew chapter 1, and so-and-so begat so-and-so. And I thought, well, what am I going to do here? So somehow I opened to 1 Corinthians chapter 1. probably, I don't know, I probably just flipped and said, I'll start someplace else. And that book came alive to me. All of a sudden I was getting excited. I hadn't experienced that the whole year as a non-Christian. And that was the Holy Spirit grabbing my heart and bringing illumination and encouragement. And I just loved it. I just couldn't believe what was happening to me. So, normally, when we read the Bible, we do what I did. We skip over those lists. I remember all those genealogies. I remember a couple years ago, I was listening to a fabulous message by S. Lewis Johnson on Matthew chapter 1. And he was going through that genealogy, and he was even making personal applications. And I thought, oh, this is great. There's stuff in there. And that's the case in 2 Timothy chapter 4. So I want to look at that for a moment. These are Paul's final words. And remember, our point is repeated personal contact and emphasizing relationships. He mentions Demas has forsaken me, having loved this present world and gone to Thessalonica. Demas was a rank deserter. He'd forsaken the Apostle Paul, and yet he had been on missionary journeys with Paul. And I think this plays into the idea that you can always tell a true Christian by how he behaves. I think sometimes you don't know for sure, but certainly the Apostle Paul did, or he wouldn't have invited him. And yet he fell away. He's a believer, but you can't establish assurance of salvation by looking at someone's life, because you don't know what's going on underneath. Crescens went to Dalmatia, Titus to Galatia. He was one of the rank and file. We don't know much about him, and that may be the point. One of these unnamed, unmentioned people in history. Then there was Titus, who went to Galatia. He was a distinguished officer in my lingo. Every army needs one. And Paul sent him to Dalmatia. In other passages in the New Testament, he's described as one who was very enthusiastic for the cause. And he was often Paul's representative. He was the kind of person, apparently, that Paul could send on a mission and get it done. Then there was Luke. Every army needs a medical officer. And Luke, the beloved physician, was Paul's, in fact, he's the only one he calls beloved, was Paul's medical officer in the army. Paul led Luke to Christ, and Luke helped Paul on the mission field. Here you have your first medical missionary. Mark, you remember him. He was the dropout on the first missionary journey, where Paul didn't want anything to do with him and didn't want him to have anything to view with the future mission. But Barnabas took him on, the son of encouragement, that's what his name means, and changed that man's life. And at the end of life, Paul says, bring Mark with you, for he's profitable to me in the ministry. Next, we had the general's attaché, Tychicus, was sent to Ephesus, according to that passage. But Tychicus I have sent to Ephesus, chapter 4, verse 12. Now he traveled with Paul and Timothy for 3 months. Paul called him a dear brother, a faithful minister, and a fellow servant. Paul had sent him to Crete to relieve Titus, and now he sends him to Ephesus to relieve Timothy, so that Timothy can come and see Paul in prison. Next is Carpus. We know nothing about him, except Paul says, when you come, bring the cloak which I left at Troas with Carpus and the books, especially the parchments. So Carpus was one that could be trusted with Paul's most precious possession, the scriptures, the scrolls, from where he could study his Old Testament. Then there was Alexander the coppersmith, one who did them much harm. Paul says, Alexander the coppersmith did me much harm. The Lord will repay him according to his deeds. Be on guard against him yourself, where he vigorously opposed our teaching. Paul goes on to say that at my first defense, no one supported me. Everyone deserted me. But the Lord stood by me and strengthened me, so that through me, the gospel, the proclamation, he says, could be made so that all the Gentiles would hear. Well, then he gives some greetings to those in Ephesus. That's where Timothy's located. Prisca and Priscilla. It's a lay couple. Paul met them when, I think wasn't in Corinth, as I recall. They were tent makers, just like Paul. And they took Paul in, and Paul led them to Christ. And he took them with him on his church planting mission to Ephesus. When Paul departed from Ephesus, remember, these are the ones that heard about Apollos and his teaching. And they discerned some things that were not quite accurate, and they took Apollos aside and helped him make the gospel more clear. Here we have one of the first illustrations of the so-called involved layman. And they're the ones that support those of us who are in full-time ministry. They seem to be extremely hospitable. They gave Paul lodging in Corinth, and in Rome, they'd set up a church in their home. They were some of Paul's oldest and dearest friends. He'd known them for 15 years, and they'd stood by him. Onesiphorus, earlier in the book, Paul says, may the Lord grant mercy on the house of Onesiphorus. For when he was in Rome, he eagerly sought me and found me and refreshed me in my chains. May the Lord grant him mercy from the Lord on that day. You see, it was dangerous to be associated with Paul in Rome. But here was a man who didn't bother him. He was going to stand by his apostle. So he was one who refreshed the apostle. And then those living elsewhere. Erastus, Paul says, remains at Corinth. And he was the director of public works. In fact, we have an inscription that we found at Corinth with his name on it. It says Director of Public Works. Most scholars believe that this is probably the same man. Trophimus, he was an Ephesian that Paul left sick at Miletus. Now Trophimus is the guy that got Paul in trouble because he was a Greek. And in his journey to Jerusalem, there was a controversy over Trophimus that upset the Jews. And they accused Paul of bringing a Greek into the temple. And then greetings to those in Rome. Linus, according to tradition, he was the first bishop of Rome, after Peter and whoever. Eubulus was one who stood by Paul in Rome. Pudens was the son of a senator. Claudia was the daughter of a British king. And all the brothers. Now, I was talking about the pointlessness of lists like this. I can't remember the times I've skipped through the end of 1 Timothy or 2 Timothy and just, I got to get on to the next book. But there's some lessons from the list. First of all, at the end of his life, Paul is relating to 21 different people in this one letter. In other words, he was extremely interested in relationships and people. Secondly, we see hospitality in these people. Priscilla and Aquila, courage, Onesiphorus, interlocking relationships. Paul traveled with many of these individuals. He took them on trips with him, and that's one of the ways he trained. And those he took with him, those he trained, were the ones that were there at the end. It was a vast geographical impact implied in this list. Paul's in Rome. The reach out he refers to people in Yugoslavia, in Troas, in Ephesus, in Miletus, in Thessalonica, and in Corinth. At the end of life, you see a window into a geographically broad impact that Paul has had with his life. And he impacted people from all walks of life. The son of a senator, the daughter of a British king, a clerk named Erastus in Corinth. A lot of common, ordinary people. The message, of course, is that Paul and Jesus would probably say to us, we do not need more Billy Grahams. What we need is more people like Erastus, like Onesiphorus, like Prisca and Aquila, like Trophimus. Men and women unknown to history, but loved the King and invested their lives for him. And that says something to us. He doesn't need the great and mighty to be successful. These were common, ordinary people that had a great impact for the King. The eighth key is repeated personal contact over a number of years. Repetition. If your church or your ministry is really interested in indigenous multiplication, it takes repeat trips. This is probably the key thing, because we keep coming back and coming back and coming back for 5 years. And they realize that this is serious. And it gives us opportunity to hold them accountable, because every time they're going to face us, every 6 weeks or whatever, 2 months, we're going to be asking some questions. So it creates discipline and accountability and a consciousness of a systematic long-term training program. And then finally, we need to entrust the work to them as soon as possible. We're coming back to that verse at the beginning. Paul said, entrust to them. The best way to learn something is to teach somebody else. I remember when I was with Campus Crusade, Linda and I were on staff for 8 years. And we would take these kids down on the beaches, summer conferences, California, over Christmas conferences, and we trained them how to share the 4 laws and use this little survey to make contact with people. So we took the whole group out on the beach and told them they were going to talk to people, give them the wonderful opportunity of sharing Christ, with people on the beach. Of course, they're all terrified because they think they're going to be ridiculed, people are not interested. But it was amazing what would happen to these young people, because they'd go up and start going through this survey that we had, and they found out that actually people, if you're nice and not pushy, they are interested and they'll talk to you and they're not going to laugh at you. And it got them over their fear. I found today in my own life, I go back to those experiences I had. You know, every time a workman comes to my house, I immediately say, well, it could be a divine appointment, Lord. I'm a professional Christian, so I don't hang out with non-believers, and I can't find them real easily. And so I'll say, well, where do you go to church? That's my opening deal. Are there some good churches around here? Oh, no, I don't go to church. Well, why? And, well, you know, all the hypocrites or, you know, whatever. And I found that almost inevitably, just by throwing out that open question, and I'm not afraid. I guess it's because I did it for 8 years with Crusade. You know, win some and you lose some, but you might as well see if God wants you to talk to this guy. There's a book out that Prof. Hendricks had us read called Dedication and Leadership Techniques. It's written by a man in England who was formerly the head of the Communist Party there. And he describes the training techniques of the communists. I think this book was written in the 60s. I'm not sure. Somebody may know that. Maybe Yoda there remembers. He said one of the things that they did when they had a new convert, he would come into their evangelistic meeting and demonstrate he was interested in whatnot. They'd give him a few how-tos, and then they'd send him out on a street corner with a stack of papers to pass out. And of course, he got out on the street corner, and people were mad at him. They got into arguments with him. Some people laughed at him, and they knew that would happen. But then, a month or two later, they would come by to this guy and say, you know what? We're having a course on questions and objections people raise against communism. Would you be interested? Oh, yeah, I've been blasted for the last 2 months. So the point was, create a need, create the desire. Jesus sent them out, and they ran into all kinds of things, demons they couldn't cast out. Then he would say, okay, well, let's go up to the mountains. And they discussed it. We've done this with 2 churches that I've been involved in. There's been other situations, but we did one with a church here in Dallas where we trained 10 couples, walked them through some courses, and then that church took over the BEE ministry in Uzbekistan. Their name was on it, not ours. We didn't care whose name was on it. We just wanted the training out there. And they took trips, I think 4 or 5 times a year for several years. Eventually, they bought a printing press and put it in there. This is great for us because we didn't have to spend any money. The church paid for the whole deal. Another church, in fact, some of you may have heard it, Midland Bible Church. We trained a bunch of their laymen. And they have launched the most incredible ministry in Africa right now. We sent them out, and it's all theirs. Their name's on it. People there don't even know BE. And they've got 3 generations going now, and a strategy by committed leaders from I think it's 12 African countries. So they come in 3 or 4 times a year. I think it's for a week or 2 weeks. Then they go back out. And those leaders, not us, not Midland Bible Church, came up with a strategy to get this training to 40,000 people. Now we'll see. But they've already got about 10,000 involved in training. And again, it's the nationals teaching the nationals. The result of doing this, of implementing these 9 keys, as I've stressed over and over, is likely multiplication. About 4 or 5 years ago, the Romanians invited me to a celebration. I think it was 25 years of BE or something. And I hadn't been there, frankly, since the 90s. And I was blown away. There was 180 leaders there from every denomination. They were sending missionaries out to other countries. But the most exciting thing to me was when the wall fell down in '89, they planted 1,200 churches. And the reason they could do that is that all these, I think it was around 3,000 or so, BE trained people that they could immediately put in leadership positions in these churches. And I just thought, praise God, that's the kind of stuff we wanted to see. Back to the Mamertine prisons. Shortly after Paul wrote these words, he went to his death. According to the church historians, this took place in either 67 or 68 AD. The Neronian persecutions began in 64. According to the Acts of Paul, he was sentenced to death, and the charge was treason. His death occurred 3 miles from Rome, near the Ostian Way, in a little pinewood glade called the Three Fountains. They'd marched Paul there the day before, and he stayed in a little shack. We don't know if Timothy got there in time, or John Mark, but we do know that if they did, the sounds coming from that little shack were not of weeping, but rejoicing. He himself said, "We are sorrowful, yet always rejoicing, and dying, behold, we live." Early dawn, the soldiers came and they tied Paul to a pillar, put him on his knees and tied him to a pillar. And then they began to beat him with rods. The executioner was ready, stark naked. Then mercifully, the executioner's sword fell. A rich Roman lady, tradition says her name was Lucina, offered a burial plot for the apostle. So here ends the life of the greatest of the apostles and the greatest missionary in the history of the church. It was a heroic life, the life of a warrior for his king, who was committed to winning others to Christ and discipling them through indigenous multiplication. He had labored more abundantly than all the apostles, and yet, towards the end of his life, he said, "I'm the least of the apostles." A couple years later, he said, "I'm the least of the saints." And then, just before his death, he said, "I'm the chief of sinners." His humility grew as he ripened for heaven. Paul had passed through life as an unknown, an insignificant player on Rome's pretentious stage, and he died unnoticed by the great and mighty of his age. And yet, how infinitely more noble, more valuable, and enduring was his life work than the dizzying march of conquerors like Alexander the Great or Napoleon, who died of a drunken fit in Babylon or of a broken heart on the Isle of St. Helena. They pursued myriads of money, destroying perhaps millions of lives in their ambitious pursuit of vain glory. And yet those empires that they created have long crumbled to dust. Yet that lonely old man, the apostle, had launched a movement that would change the course of history. Rome is no more. We believe, in conclusion, that if we embrace the Lord's command, we heed Paul's strategy and implement the 9 keys, we can fulfill our Lord's desire that many thousands of leaders will be raised up so that thousands of tongues will sing his praises. Let's stand.